that it is possible that a perfect being exists, and it is equally possible that a perfect being does not exist. That would lead to a conclusion that a perfect being does and does not exist, which is logical to say that it is impossible to prove either one.
Well, you couldn't have those both be true. Well, what that would show, so what this argument would entail, I think, is that you couldn't have both premises simultaneously true. So you couldn't say that it's possible a necessary being exists and that it's possible that the thing doesn't exist, because that would entail a contradiction. So what you would have then is that, you would have to reject one of the two premises. I don't think you could have the two premises simultaneously true in the argument. It would entail a contradiction. Yeah. The guy, in the back there, I don't think he's spoken yet, actually.
What I want to say that if you say if I exist or anyone here exists, this I can measure it with a physical. It's here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe the God have something we can't measure.
Yep.
This thing. Yeah. Science discovers a lot of materials.
Sure. Yeah.
Elements.
Empirical science does. Yeah.
Why? Why we don't take this the logic is the God maybe have something we can't measure, mm-hmm. that maybe it exists, but we can't know this. What?
Sure. I mean, I take the point. Of course, in metaphysics, we are dealing with truths that we can't measure in that sort of direct kind of way. What is a metaphysical truth? I mean, are they empirically verifiable, for example? I don't know, Hartshorne sort of played with the idea that, and there's sort of has a Kantian ring about it, right? That the metaphysical truths are the ones that are just sort of verified by all possible experiences, So we can't falsify them, for example. Like there's no experiment you can run to show that they're not true, right? But they're sort of a factor in every possible experience that you could have. There's no experience you can have that can falsify 2 and 3 make 5, right? But you accept that. But that's because almost every experience would verify it, right? That's one way of sort of thinking about it. I know sometimes people worry about the idea that, look, we get fixated on empirical knowledge and on empirical sciences. And so we sort of think of these as our paradigmatic ways of knowing. And that's because we do know many things through our senses, and we are sensory-dependent animals. But mathematical truths aren't like that. You don't know 2 and 3 make 5 because you did experiments. That's not how you know that. They're true a priori. I mean, of course, somebody taught you how to use the numerals, right? 2 and 3. But what makes 2 and 3 together, the fact that 2 and 3 together make 5 is not something that is a posteriori known. It's not something we know through experiments or observation in the way that we know, quasars exist, or that we know that, or we know the chemical compounds that go into water or something like this. I know people are sometimes suspicious of metaphysical truths because they're not, empirically verifiable or something like this, or falsifiable. We don't know them with experiments. But there are lots of other things you accept as perfectly good knowledge that didn't come through the senses, like math and logic. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I found it very interesting that Leibniz got stuck with this idea that you're looking for an inconsistency in perfection, because he was a great mathematician, maybe one of the greatest, in fact. And in fact, modern mathematician, maybe not in the time of Leibniz, but nowadays explicitly say that whatever is consistent exists in the mathematical world.
Yeah.
That's to link with and that's all what exists in the mathematical world, actually, sort of tautology or things like that.
Usually you do have
actually, I feel that
proof usually,
this
right?
proof boils down in modern terms just to that. That if something is consistent, then it must exist. So in particular, perfection or God or whatever you put in it, somehow. It is just, model logic is looking at, there are also some mathematicians who are studying that, but
Yeah.
it looked a bit suspiciously by most logicians, I would say, in mathematics.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, you're thinking like Quine, of course, right? But
Well, the whole development of model logic. But anyway,
Yeah.
I mean, okay,
well, look,
let's put this aside.
of course, as like a formal theory, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's like as a formal theory, it's fine. The only sticky parts are about when we talk about interpretations of the formal theory.
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean,
forget about
yeah.
it. Forget about this last remark.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think it's much more than
Yeah.
this acceptance, which was not an obvious thing, maybe,
Yeah.
that if something is consistent,
Yeah.
then we sort of must accept it, but then in a possible world, as you say.
Well, that's right. But look, there are plenty of consistent states of affairs that don't obtain, right? So Hillary Clinton's being president, that's a consistent state of affairs. It doesn't obtain, but in a possible world. This is a special case because it's one that
Divided the possibility, I mean, the
Yeah.
existence into possible and necessary. Or
Yes,
something
yeah,
like that.
uh-huh, yeah.
That's maybe the suspicious part in my view, but that's...
yeah. Potatoes, I guess. I don't know. The gentleman in the vest, I think he's had his hand up for a while. Yeah. You, yeah.
I just want to check the last slide, please.
The last slide? With Leibniz, the one with Leibniz on it?
Not the last one, the reflection, just one before it. Not this. At the end, when you prove
Sorry,
that,
yeah.
yeah, we're 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah, I think.
Can we get to the whole,
Yeah, exactly. This
the whole proof? There it is. This one?
Apart from the God,
Uh-huh.
because I think it's related to the belief of each one of us, since, for example, if this one had the conclusion that the God exists, as, for example, as I believe, so I will say, yeah, this is a good rule. If I am an atheist, I will say, no, it's not. So if we take out the, regarding the argument, if we take out that there is a perfect being exists, regarding to make it, yeah?
Here, these are the premises here.
I will take out only the perfect being exists, okay? And I can replace it with other phrase. In order to make it logic, we all know about the terroristic attacks happening everywhere. And I will assume that it's possible that there is someone here, he's holding a bomb, and he's gonna explode after just about 5, 10, 15 minutes, and you're all gonna die. And then this is possibly, because it's logic, because about the terroristic attacks.
It's consistent,
And I can have it at the end, it's necessarily, we're all gonna die. But from the atheist point of view, they are gonna say that, okay, this guy, he does not exist, and I will say that, okay, you have to make sure that it's impossibly exists. So this one makes me, it's like...
Here's the issue, is that your frightening scenario is not covered by the second premise, right? So, yeah.
Actually, why not? Because it's logically. Somewhat...
It's a logical consistency, so it would be a contingent sort of truth, but it's not the sort of thing such that necessarily, if it happens, it necessarily happens, right? It's the sort of event such that if it happens, it happens, but it's not the sort of event such that if it happens, it had to happen, right? Because if it happens, there's a possible world in which it did not happen, right? So it's not the sort of thing such that if it did happen, it must happen. In the case of the God, of a perfect being or a necessary being, what we're saying is if it exists, then it had to exist. That's different from the contingent event you're speaking of. The contingent event is such that if it happens, necessarily, if it happens, it happens, right? But it's not true that if it happens, it necessarily happens. You don't get this embedded necessity in the contingent truth case that you're thinking of. Yeah, this guy, the one behind the guy who just spoke. Yeah.
Okay, now I understand that if it's possible that God exists, so he must be exist.
Yes,
Okay.
That's the upshot of the proof, exactly. Yeah.
But you confirm the existence of God on possibility which is 50-50. يعني,
I'm sorry, say that again?
you confirm God existence on a possibility that it's 50-50. Why you say يعني he may not exist and he may exist? The same.
So this, I take it to be equivalent to...
Why you say he is possible exist, he may, it's possible he is not exist.
Okay, so if you say that it's possible that he exists, right, What this proof does is it shows that he necessarily does. So if you think, for example, there's a 50-50 shot. So let's say like you're an agnostic and you think there's a 50-50 chance. You think it's possible he does, it's possible he doesn't. And you give like, you weight them like equally, 50-50 shot. From the fact that you give the 50% chance to the idea that he does exist, it will follow that he necessarily exists, and you need to readjust to the probabilities, right? What I'm essentially what this proof is showing is that there is no 50-50 about it. It's either the necessary being does exist, or the necessary being does not. It cannot exist. And so it has to be. There is no fence sitting. That's like what I think is the interesting upshot of the proof. Is since it's valid, the agnostic can't just sit on the fence and say, I think it's possible he exists, but it's also possible he doesn't. He has to say something like, I don't know whether the concept is consistent, right? So I don't know whether the necessary being does exist or whether it can't exist. But there's no like, the odds are one way and the other, because if you admit that the odds are at all in favor of possibility, the proof shows that it necessarily exists.
And the conclusion knows that God exists.
The conclusion is, strictly speaking, that a necessary being exists. The reason we call this a proof for the existence of God is this step here, where we say something like, whatever God is a necessary being, right? So since I've just shown that a necessary being exists, we've shown for all intents and purposes that God exists. That's the idea. But that's why I said there are limitations on the proof, because it shows a necessary being exists. Conventionally, we apply the word God to mean that thing, and that's the idea. Does it show that it doesn't show any particular religion is correct? Again, I mean, I want to emphasize this point. It just shows that, look, the thing that traditional theists sort of at least something exists which has at least one of the properties traditionally ascribed by traditional theist views to God, namely necessary existence. Something like that does exist, necessarily so, if you accept the premises. Yes, sitting next to you. Yeah. Oh, yeah, her. Yeah.
Yes, but what would happen if I changed the first premise and I said it is possible that a perfect being does not exist? Wouldn't it imply automatically that it does not exist at all, and the argument would be valid the same?
No, because what you would get is the negation of the antecedent of this conditional. So you can't infer from if P then Q, not P, not Q. That's not a valid argument. That's a fallacy of denying the antecedent. So it's not a valid argument. So no, you couldn't infer that a necessary being necessarily a being doesn't exist from it is possible that God does not exist. That won't get you that God necessarily does not exist. Yeah.
Not exist by inexistent.
It is possible. What is the difference between God doesn't exist and God is inexistent?
There is not, of course, but formally there is one. That's not a negation.
Well, I mean, so how do you want to formalize this then? If you have yeah, so what's going to be the difference when I flesh it out formally? So I say it's yeah.
So the only change I can
Yeah.
the only negative, the only not word
Yeah.
I put is after the is. It is not possible that perfectly exists.
Here's how,
The first sentence.
yeah. What you would have to do is again, you would say it is not possible that a perfect being exists. So you.
Does not exist. This implies that it may or may not.
I don't think it does imply that, but because saying like something's not the case doesn't imply that the other thing might be the case. I don't think that's generally true. But if you have in mind like this 50-50 kind of thought, where if you say, well, God doesn't exist, but he might, like that's the 50-50 kind of thinking. Then that it still implies that he would in that case. But I don't think in general you can't say something is not the case doesn't imply the other thing might be the case, because there are no square circles doesn't imply that there can be square circles, right? Because they're impossible. Let's get. I should know your name now. I'm going to think of it here in a minute.
Doesn't matter.
Mahmoud.
Yeah, Mahmoud.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that if we say that it's not possible that a perfect being exists, and necessarily a perfect being cannot exist. And if we say that a perfect being cannot exist, or cannot, if it's necessarily if a perfect being cannot exist, so it's necessarily that a perfect being doesn't exist. Okay? The flow of thought can't be this way. Yeah, we say that it's possible that a perfect being doesn't exist. We must put it's that there is no perfect being. Okay? So if we just prove that there is no perfect being, we divide it from the original cause, that the thinking that a 50-50 possibility may not be actually is not valid. Yeah, God does not exist. Is not a valid argument. We can't do the anti-modal ontological argument because we will divert from the first, from the proof that a perfect being is existent, because it's possible that a perfect being does not exist, okay? Or it's not possible that a perfect being exists. So it's necessarily that there is no perfect being, okay? Or a perfect being, or there is no perfect being, okay? Let's follow my thought.
What are you suggesting we're negating here? Because if you're negating, if you want to negate just, so, but which part of this? So it's like, I didn't put it in symbols, but you know, it's important where the negation goes. This is correct.
If I negated the first sentence and negated the second sentence, I should think that we diverted from the original cause.
So you want to negate this and say it's not possible that a perfect being exists? So that's okay. Yeah, if you yes, you wouldn't.
Won't lead us to that God does not exist.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. You can get an anti-ontological argument out of this. I agree.
We can't get the anti-modal ontological argument.
You can't.
I think that I can't.
Yeah. Well, that's why to get the anti-ontological argument, you'd have to negate the conclusion, right? And then go modus tollens to show that this thing is impossible to exist. Right? That's why I'm saying you can get an anti-ontological argument out of this only if you can sort of show me that the thing is impossible. That or to say something like, you could maybe tweak number 2 here or something like that. I mean, but you're right. If you want to just negate this first thing and say it's possible that a perfect being doesn't exist. I mean, is that what you're saying? It's possible that a perfect being doesn't exist. That's not going to get you the anti-modal ontological argument. That's right. Yes. If you just negate, it's possible that a perfect being does not exist, right? You don't get the conclusion. It doesn't follow that a perfect being cannot exist.
Why? There's a 50-50
well,
possibility cannot work here.
I don't understand where you put the negation.
Yep. Yes. So, look, if I say, so it's possible that P, right? There are 2 things, like when you put a negation on here, you do something like, it is not possible that P, or you could say, it is possible that not P. These 2 are logically consistent. So it's logically consistent to say, you can assert that it's possible that P, and it's possible that not P, right? It's possible that I'm over 2 meters tall, and it's also possible that I'm not over 2 meters tall, because in fact I'm not, right? But there's a possible world in which I am. What is inconsistent is to go, it's possible that P, and it's not possible that P, because here you're negating the possibility, and here you're negating the proposition. To say that something is not possible is to say that it is impossible that P. Right?
Okay, I get it.
In other words, necessarily, this is equivalent to necessarily not P.
Yes.
That's why it matters.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so to go back to this earlier one, if you only negate this, and you say it's possible that God doesn't exist, then one of the premises is an antecedent cube sort of premise, and this is a logical fallacy. Right? You can't infer from the negation of the antecedent to the negation of the consequent. That's a fallacy. That's an invalid argument. Okay. Please get her.
If God equals the perfect being, okay? So the perfect being demands the perfect action, right? The perfect being demands perfect actions, right? So I can't see any perfect actions this word or this dimension.
Right.
So God doesn't exist for me.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
So this is the kind of move that the atheist has to make. Is something like you have to show that there's a logical inconsistency somehow
Yes.
in the idea of God. I'm not going to commit myself to those particular details at the moment because I am not prepared to have that debate. So you're right. If you can show that somehow the idea of a necessary being is somehow tied up with the non-existence of evil.
Yes.
And so, like, but notice there's still a high bar you have to meet. You have to show that there is no possible apology you can give, right?
Yes.
So, but if it's possible God has a reason that we don't know, that sort of thing, then
I think
you
it's
haven't shown
some
logical
kind of a
consistency.
struggle in all the other dimensions. If you say that the God is in all of the other dimensions or the other worlds, so I think that there is a struggle between them, and we're just the other reflection in this world, and they all like.
Could be. Could
Yes.
be. I have no comment on that. I have no idea. That's beyond me. That's
Yes.
good.
And I think actually that God in the other dimension is just drunk because he leave us here and like that.
It could be.
Yeah, it's cool.
When are we going to call time on this here? Oh, okay, he's had his hand up for a long time, actually. You have two ideas, right? Is it- yeah.
So I want to re-ask the question I've just asked. If we modify the second premise and said that necessarily a perfect being cannot exist, does that leave us with God cannot exist?
You mean something like you sort of flip this around somehow and you say
and said that a perfect being cannot exist.
That would, you might be able to generate a kind of version of this would be a kind of version of the anti-ontological argument. You replace my premise 2 with something like the impossibility, the impossible object, right?
Okay,
and now
so-
you can show
so
the
that's
impossible
valid.
object can't exist. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a second question. If we assume that God is not a perfect being, then he wouldn't necessarily exist.
That's
Would he?
true. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But like, why assume that? Yeah. So.
I think perfection actually contradicts itself. Like if there is that famous paradox, can God actually create a rock that is too heavy for him to actually lift?
Yeah, the answer is no. That's not a possible task, though. So what you do is you define...
so he can't do anything?
No, that's not
or
true.
Everything.
That's not true. You define omnipotence not as the ability to do anything, but as the ability to do anything that's logically possible. It's not logically possible to create a stone so heavy that God himself can't lift it. That's why there's a paradox.
Okay.
So, since it's not logically possible, God can't do it. But that's not a limitation on his powers, because omnipotence is just the ability to do anything logically possible.
Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, there is an answer to that. So next time some sophist tries to stick you with that one, just pull that out of your pocket. Yeah. Well, actually, he's had his hand up for a long time. Sorry. I have a right-hand bias. You know, so.
I'm not really sure why are we saying that God is a necessary being. I mean, this whole argument is valid for a necessary being.
Yes,
But for it to be valid to a perfect being like God, I'd have to say that God is a necessary being. And I don't think that this is something that is a fact. I think that this is just an assumption. And I can assume otherwise.
Okay,
yeah.
Yeah, you
is
are
it that
free to assume
easy?
otherwise. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, look, if for some reason you don't like the identification of the necessary being with the perfect being, then, okay, this proof won't, then you are essentially denying this step, right? So you're going to say something like, yeah, you've shown a necessary being exists, but you haven't shown God exists. I think that sounds a little weird to me, but you could say that. That's perfectly all right, because the proof just shows that. The proof just shows that there is that if a necessary being is possible, then a necessary being exists. And if you want, if you don't think God is
perfect.
Yeah, if you don't think God is a necessary being, or like you think perfection doesn't entail necessary existence or something, okay, then you just don't think this shows that God exists. Then I guess. Yeah, and that's okay. I mean, I don't know like what to tell you on that. We just disagree about what conditions God would meet. Like what kind of thing God would be if He exists, and that's just a fundamental disagreement, I guess. Yeah. Oh yeah, right next to you. Yes.
My problem isn't the consistency between perfection and possibility and necessity. My problem is the necessity itself. How can we say that it is necessary to have a being? Why is it necessary, in fact? However, not this perfect or not this being. How can we tell that something is truly necessary? So it's an axiom. It's something that we assumed.
Well, I mean, yeah, there are assumptions being used here, but the assumption is just it's possible a necessary being exists. And I guess if you're going to deny that, then what you're going to say is that it's not possible for a necessary being to exist.
My problem is with the term necessary itself. How can we say that there is a necessary being?
Well, like that.
Then like that I can say there is no necessary being if it is that easy.
No,
of course there's
no, because the argument's valid. You have to tell me which premise you reject if you're going to reject this one.
I'm not rejecting that perfect being is necessary. I am rejecting that there's anything necessarily.
Well, what about the mathematical truths? You think those aren't necessary?
Well,
yeah.
We assume the numbers at the end. We assume that there are numbers. There is 1, there is 2, there is 3, and we assume that 2 plus 3 is 5. We made this assumption, and we said that all the world shall be like this. So there is nothing that necessarily necessary.
So that's certainly. I'm not quite sure what I want to say about conventionalist lines like that, actually. So. But notice, though, that like if you think the mathematical truths are just conventional, right, it doesn't follow that they're not necessary. You just say they're necessary relative to the conventions we have stipulated. So defining 2 to mean what it means, defining the plus function to mean what it means, and 3 to mean what it means, and 5 to mean what it means, it follows that 2 plus 3 is 5 necessarily, right? If we change the rules, maybe, I mean, again, if you change the rules, then sure, maybe 2 plus 3 doesn't equal 5 anymore. But that's a case where you've changed the rules. Yeah.
But this still means that math is necessarily okay, but a being isn't necessary, however.
Well, this purports to show that there is a necessary being. So again, you got to tell me which premise you don't like. Yeah. I mean, look, so not every being is a necessary being. I mean, I take it that I am not a necessary being. I didn't exist at one point, and I'm not going to exist at another point, right? And so I take it that I'm not a necessary being. I'm contingent. So some beings, you can't read from X is possible to X is true, right? That's why this is a special case. That's one plausible reason why people think there could only be one of these things if there is one at all, right?
So here we are taking necessity out of being from existing in all the points. That's the necessity that we are assuming.
The necessity we are assuming is existing in every possible world, yeah. But there's only one thing there's at least one thing that does that, right? A necessary being. Not all the beings do that, though, right? So there are possible worlds in which I was never born, for example.
How do you know that?
Well, because I take it that I'm not a necessary being. I mean, I guess I could just be like, maybe I'm a necessary being and I just don't know it. I mean, I guess that's true. But like, I take it for granted that I was born at one point. Right? And so ipso facto, I didn't exist before 1983. I mean, like, I just take that to be the case. Yeah. What's that? I do trust that, yeah, that's right. But it's an empirical, I mean, that's the empirical thing again.
It's the same chronological order of thought. You trust something, the source that's telling you something.
Yeah.
And this is what you build your logic on. Same as the gentleman in front was saying that Abraham thought that he should cut his son's
I mean, let me put it this way, like, I don't have a proof that I'm not the necessary being. That's right. But I also don't have a proof that I am a necessary being. So I can't prove that I am identical with this thing. So maybe I am, but like this is a different kind of proof, right? What all this thing is supposed to show is that there's a necessary being. And I haven't told you what that being is. I guess that could be me. And I suppose it could be the case that like everyone's been lying to me this whole time. And I guess that's true. And I'll grant that. I'll concede the point. Well, I know, but his point is that like I got that on testimony. So, I mean, maybe like, huh? You could kill me. Yeah, that would prove it. That would certainly prove it. Please don't, but like that would prove it. Yeah. So, it would prove the point in a very, very vivid way. Yeah.
I think there's also something to say about the meaning of exist.
Yeah.
What is proved there is that it exists as a concept. It's not inconsistent. Well, it starts with the idea it's not inconsistent, but it's finished with the same. And finally, the kind of existence proof there are just as a concept. So like mathematical proof, a mathematical existence, exactly.
Sure, yeah, but in a mathematical, it's like a mathematical existence proof. That's exactly right. But when you do a mathematical existence proof, you're proving that some mathematical object exists. There's a prima facie.
To prove that, you need only to prove that it's consistent.
That's right. Well, that's also what I've got here. That's true.
Prove that it's impossible actually to prove, but in a certain sense.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah, that's certainly right. So certainly in mathematics, you just have to prove the thing is consistent and then it exists. Then you prove it exists. So again, I mean, this falls short of a demonstration in that sense because I don't have a consistency proof. You're right. But what I do have is that if you grant that it's consistent, then the thing necessarily exists. And so it is, in a sense, it would, okay, so maybe the being is one of the numbers then. I mean, maybe all I've shown is just that prime numbers exist or something. I mean, I still think that's a remarkable thing to show, is that, you know.
Themselves, I mean, it's really hard. I mean, what does it mean, the mathematical existence exactly?
Sure, I mean, yeah. I mean, people debate this all the time, and, you know, yeah, okay. We could be Platonists, we could be constructivists, we could be, you know, Hilbert-type guys, you know, Hilbertians. Oh, yes, you haven't said anything.
I would like to say that God exists, but it doesn't. That God exists, and it is necessary existence. And according to the guy who said it is necessary, it is necessary at first and possible. It is possible after that. No, it is necessary, possible at first, because in order to know, as a research and logic, is God existence or not. Then after that, when I trust that God exists, then it is necessary to exist. This is something. But according to perfect being, I don't think so. That God, He is perfect. We don't know who is good at all. But we need Him in our depression and what I'm going to say, that we need Him in our wishes. He is a supernatural power. So either He is God or any other name, then He exists. That is it.
Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
With respect to the first point, I mean, it almost sounds like you're making, so Anselm's motto was faith seeking understanding, right? And his idea was that you sort of start out with sort of the belief in the existence of God, and then you try to sort of supplement this with rational proofs. That was the idea. And that's why he starts out with, of course, Anselm never doubts that God exists, right, that kind of thing. But, you know, he just tries to show that he wants a rationally compelling sort of proof. And so I think that speaks to the point you're making there. The other thing I'll say is this point you made, the second point you made, certain philosophers, like the American pragmatist philosophers, so like Peirce and Charles Hartshorne, they both suggested, Hartshorne in particular, suggested that this proof should be supplemented with a kind of pragmatic argument like you're talking about. So when we ask about like whether the God is a being that possibly exists, Hartshorne thought, well, maybe we should talk about the utility of the belief to our daily lives in the way you're speaking, and that maybe that's one way we can show that the being possibly exists, or that it's rational to believe that it's possible that it exists, something like that. To sort of underpin hopes, as you're saying, I think. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's right. Yeah. I mean, that's right. I mean, it's just a proof for the existence of God, almost in name only, I suppose. But yeah. I don't think he's spoken yet. Yeah. So let's get it to him.
I think this argument depends on the perfection principle and the necessity of the condition.
Yep.
But inside the condition, there is another necessity.
Yes.
I see there is some sort of leap that if a perfect being exists, then he necessarily exists, which I see no reason for the second necessity. Maybe he is still possible. I see the perfection principle must be if a perfect being exists, then it is possible that he exists, not necessary. I see here you are asserting a necessity as an attribute, like attributing the existence, like what Descartes did. Maybe everything is possible and there is no necessary thing. We just put a definition of a necessary and start build on it, and maybe there is no such thing in reality called necessary. Maybe our definition leads to consistency, but it's not true in reality.
Well, I'm going to start with the last point first. I mean, I'm not really sure how to convince you that there are necessary truths, except to just point out the infinite number of them that mathematicians discover all the time. Okay, so with respect to the suspicion that there's it sounds like you sort of think that maybe there's a question begging going on here or something like that I'm assuming existence in there. So this is why it's important. Let me go back to the board here. I'll have to yell. So, I mean, that's why it's important that so here's something trivial. If something perfect exists, then something perfect exists. Right? That's trivial. And if I were going to argue something perfect exists, therefore something perfect exists, that's clearly circular. Right? But what I'm not saying that, however. That's why the scope of the modal operators matters. Now I take it that if something perfect exists, then something perfect exists is itself a necessary truth. So I take it that conditional is necessary. But the second part is not necessary in the condition. So I take it that this is necessary. And that's because this is a tautology. Right? Now, my justification for adding it in on the second one here is that I'm defining the concept of a perfect being. Right? So the second modal operator has to go here. It has to go there because I'm defining a perfect being. So I take it that this is just a conceptual definition of what a perfect being is. It's a being such that if it exists, then it necessarily exists. Now, it isn't. I'm not committing to the claim that it does exist. Of course, I think the proof there is one. All I'm committed to is just this conditional. The being, if it exists, is characterized as a thing that necessarily exists if it does. Right? But I haven't assumed that it does yet. That's what makes it non-question begging. Descartes is something like this. God is a being characterized by the perfections. Among the perfections are omnipotence, omniscience, benevolence, existence. Therefore, God exists. And of course, the atheist will reject the first premise because he's going to say, well, either existence isn't one of the perfections or God isn't a thing characterized by existence. And so he doesn't have all the perfections. Right? In this case, I'm just saying this is what a perfect being is. And so the atheist is free to reject my definition of a perfect being, but then I'm going to ask him to supply another one for me because I'm not sure how to characterize a perfect being except this way. Right? And that's why I'm sort of stipulating it as a definition. There are ways there are different proofs give different kinds of specifications for this. So like Charles Hartshorne does it as God is a being such that like it's not possible that that the being exists. How does he do it? It's not possible that it exists, and it's possible that it doesn't exist. Right? Something like that. It's just the negation of this. So to say something's possible is to say something like, it's not possible that it's not the case that it exists. Sorry. Sorry, my boxes are really hideous. It's not possible that it's not the case that the perfect being doesn't. The perfect being exists and is not necessarily existent. That's one way of doing it. That's just straightforwardly equivalent to that. But some people think this sounds better, like that it has a more plausible sound to it. I don't know. I'm not really sure. They're logically equivalent, so it doesn't matter to me. But like I say, look, the atheist is free to reject that. But now I'm going to ask you this: let me have a definition then, right? Because you're telling me this thing doesn't exist. Now you tell me what it is that doesn't exist then, right? And this is the content that I see here. Okay, 5 minutes.
But can we prove that there is something necessary?
I mean, I can also just point to. So here. Okay, here's a quick one. Something necessary. Which one? So, P or not P? Okay, I take it those are the only options. Either P is true or P is false. If my students are about to pull their hair out. If not P is true, then if P is true, then not P must be false. If P is false, not P must be true. Right? Okay, but we have P or not P. This is what this is. This is or, right? Okay, so true or false is true. False or true is true. So there you go. It is not possible for P or not P to be false. There's a necessary truth for you. Now it's a very humble necessary truth, I admit, but it's a necessary truth. Tell me how it's possible for P or not P to be true.
Is there a difference between this proof and Gödel's proof?
Yes, Gödel's proof is ferociously complicated, and I don't understand it. That's one major difference. Okay, yeah. All right, good.